Margaret Wilson believed she had buried her darkest secret forever. For 6 long months, nobody suspected a thing. But when police uncover a shocking clue hidden deep inside Blackwood Forest, her carefully constructed world begins to collapse. As terrifying visions, mysterious messages, and relentless investigators close in, Margaret realizes one chilling truth. Some secrets never stay buried. Welcome to Dark Lantern Stories. Before we begin, tell us in the comments your city, country, and current time. If you enjoy mysterious stories filled with shocking secrets, please subscribe and like this video if you have not already. Tonight we bring you a chilling tale titled, "She Thought Her Secret Was Safe Until the Police Knocked." Margaret Wilson stood at the kitchen window of her beautiful countryside home, staring at the heavy rain falling outside. The storm had arrived suddenly, turning the peaceful evening into a dark and uneasy night. She held a cup of tea with trembling hands, although she could not explain why she felt nervous. Everything should have been perfect. Her husband, Daniel Wilson, had disappeared exactly 6 months earlier. The police had searched for weeks and found nothing. Friends, neighbors, and family members had eventually accepted that Daniel had probably abandoned his old life and started somewhere new. Even the police had nearly stopped asking questions. Margaret believed she had finally escaped the nightmare. She believed her secret was buried forever. At least that was what she told herself every morning when she looked into the bathroom mirror. Margaret was 42 years old, elegant, respected, and admired throughout the small town of Raven Hill. She volunteered at the local church, organized charity events, and regularly visited elderly residents. Everyone described her as kind, generous, and devoted. Nobody suspected that beneath her warm smile lived a woman carrying a terrifying secret. 6 months earlier, Daniel had not disappeared. Daniel had died inside their own home, and Margaret knew exactly what had happened. The story truly began many years before. Margaret had married Daniel in the summer of 1998. At first, their marriage seemed ideal. Daniel owned a successful construction business. They lived comfortably and traveled often. Friends envied their happiness. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. As years passed, Daniel changed. Financial problems slowly damaged his personality. His business began losing money. He became angry, suspicious, and controlling. He monitored Margaret constantly, questioning every phone call, every purchase, and every visit with friends. Margaret felt trapped. She stopped attending social gatherings. She avoided conversations about her marriage. To outsiders, she maintained the image of a happy wife. Inside the house, however, tension grew like a poisonous vine. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a cold evening in November, exactly 6 months before Daniel vanished. Daniel returned home late. He had been drinking heavily. Witnesses later confirmed seeing him at a local bar. Margaret remembered hearing his truck enter the driveway shortly after 10 o'clock. She had been reading in the living room. The argument started almost immediately. Daniel accused Margaret of hiding money from him. He demanded access to her personal savings account. Margaret refused. The shouting intensified. According to Margaret's memory, Daniel became furious. He threw a glass across the room. It shattered against the fireplace. Margaret attempted to leave, but Daniel blocked her path. What happened next remained known only to Margaret. She replayed the moment countless times. Sometimes she convinced herself it had been self-defense. Other times she feared she had crossed an unforgivable line. During the struggle, Daniel fell. His head struck the sharp corner of a marble table. The sound still haunted Margaret's dreams. Daniel never stood again. Panic consumed her. She checked for signs of life. There were none. Terrified, Margaret faced an impossible decision. call emergency services, and explain everything or hide what had happened. Fear won. She convinced herself that nobody would believe her story. She imagined prison, disgrace, and public humiliation. So she made a terrible choice. Throughout the long night, Margaret carefully cleaned the living room. Before sunrise, she wrapped Daniel's body in heavy plastic sheeting. Using Daniel's own truck, she drove to an abandoned property deep within Blackwood Forest, a remote area once owned by Daniel's grandfather. There, beneath heavy rain and darkness, she buried him. When Daniel's disappearance was reported several days later, Margaret appeared devastated. She cried during interviews. She pleaded for information on local television. The town sympathized with her. Search teams explored rivers, forests, and abandoned buildings. Nothing was found. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation gradually faded. Life in Raven Hill returned to normal. Margaret resumed her charity work, yet she never truly escaped. Strange things began happening. It started with small events. Objects moved unexpectedly. A framed photograph of Daniel repeatedly fell from the wall, despite being securely fastened. Lights flickered. Doors opened during the night. Margaret blamed stress. She consulted doctors who suggested anxiety. She accepted their explanation, although deep inside she remained uncertain. One evening, while preparing dinner, Margaret heard footsteps upstairs. She lived alone. Frozen with fear, she slowly climbed the staircase. Every room was empty. As she turned to leave, she noticed something disturbing. The bedroom wardrobe stood open. Inside hung Daniel's favorite jacket. Margaret clearly remembered donating it months earlier. She screamed. Neighbors rushed over, but no explanation could be found. News of Margaret's strange experiences spread quietly through Raven Hill. Some whispered that grief was affecting her mind. Others wondered whether something darker was happening. Unknown to Margaret, Detective Sarah Bennett had never completely abandoned Daniel's case. Sarah was an experienced investigator with 20 years of service. Something about Daniel's disappearance troubled her. Adults occasionally disappeared voluntarily, but Daniel's case contained inconsistencies. His bank accounts remained untouched. His passport had never been used. His phone stopped functioning on the night he vanished. Most importantly, Daniel had left behind valuable assets and personal possessions. Sarah believed people rarely abandon everything without preparation. Over several months, Sarah reviewed the evidence repeatedly. She discovered small details overlooked during the original investigation. Security footage from a gas station near Blackwood Forest captured Daniel's truck during the early hours following his disappearance. The image quality was poor. The driver could not be identified. At the time, investigators assumed Daniel had been driving. Sarah was no longer certain. She requested enhanced analysis from a regional forensic laboratory. Results were delayed due to workload. Meanwhile, another development occurred. A local hunter named Thomas Reed entered Blackwood Forest, searching for deer. While exploring the abandoned Wilson property, Thomas noticed disturbed ground partially exposed by recent rainfall. Curious, he investigated further. What he discovered sent shockwaves through Raven Hill. Buried beneath the earth lay fragments of heavy plastic, and beneath the plastic, human remains. Within hours, police vehicles surrounded the remote property. Detective Sarah Bennett arrived personally. As forensic teams carefully excavated the site, Sarah felt a chilling certainty growing inside her. She already suspected whose remains had been found, yet the most frightening revelation was still coming, because hidden among the recovered evidence was an object that would completely transform the investigation and place Margaret Wilson directly in the center of a terrifying mystery. The object was a silver necklace engraved with a single word: Margaret. The silver necklace rested inside a clear evidence bag as Detective Sarah Bennett stood silently beside the excavation site in Blackwood Forest. Rain clouds gathered overhead, casting long shadows across the abandoned property. The forensic team continued carefully removing layers of wet soil. Every minute revealed new details, and each discovery deepened Sarah's suspicion. The engraved necklace had been a wedding anniversary gift from Daniel to Margaret several years earlier. Sarah remembered seeing Margaret wearing it during one of the early interviews after Daniel vanished. Yet Margaret had later claimed she had misplaced it shortly after Daniel disappeared. Now the necklace had been recovered beside human remains buried on property connected to Daniel's family. Sarah knew this could no longer be treated as a simple missing person case. The remains were transported to the county forensic laboratory for identification. Until official confirmation arrived, Sarah remained cautious. Experience had taught her that assumptions could destroy investigations. Still, she quietly reopened Daniel Wilson's case as a possible homicide investigation. By evening, news of the discovery had spread throughout Raven Hill. Residents gathered outside grocery stores, cafes, and churches, whispering anxiously. Rumors multiplied rapidly. Some believed the remains belonged to Daniel. Others speculated that a stranger had been buried in the forest years earlier. Margaret heard the news while preparing dinner. The television interrupted regular programming with a brief announcement. Human remains had been discovered in Blackwood Forest. Authorities had not released an identity. Margaret nearly dropped the plate in her hands. Her face lost all color. For several seconds, she simply stared at the television screen. Her breathing became shallow. She immediately switched off the television and sat motionless at the kitchen table. Deep inside, she already knew. The heavy rains during recent weeks must have exposed the grave. She had feared this moment every day for 6 months. Now it had arrived. Panic overwhelmed her. She considered leaving town immediately. She even packed a suitcase. But after several minutes, she forced herself to stop. Running would only make her appear guilty. She reminded herself that nobody had witnessed the burial. Nobody knew what had happened inside the house that night. She had cleaned thoroughly. She had maintained her story consistently. Perhaps the remains could not even be identified. Perhaps everything would still be fine. Yet, despite these thoughts, Margaret could not sleep. Throughout the night, strange sounds echoed through the house. At midnight, she heard footsteps moving slowly along the hallway outside her bedroom. She sat upright in bed, listening carefully. The footsteps stopped directly outside her door. Silence followed. Then came 3 slow knocks. Margaret froze. Her bedroom door remained closed. Trembling, she reached for her phone and called the police. Officers arrived within minutes and searched the property. They found no signs of forced entry, no intruder, and no explanation for the sounds. One officer suggested that stress related to the recent discovery in Blackwood Forest might be affecting Margaret. She agreed outwardly, but privately, she was terrified. The following morning, Detective Sarah Bennett requested a formal interview with Margaret. They met at the police station. Margaret appeared composed, dressed neatly and wearing a calm expression. Sarah noticed, however, that Margaret's hand shook slightly whenever Daniel's name was mentioned. Sarah began gently. She asked whether Margaret had recently visited Blackwood Forest. Margaret immediately denied it. She explained that she had not visited the abandoned property in years because the place brought back painful memories. Sarah then produced photographs from the excavation site. Margaret stared at the images with apparent shock. Finally, Sarah showed her the photograph of the silver necklace. Margaret's eyes widened for a brief moment before she regained control. She explained that she had lost the necklace months earlier and could not imagine how it had ended up there. Sarah thanked her for her cooperation, but inside, she became even more suspicious. After the interview ended, Sarah ordered forensic testing on the necklace. She also requested a complete re-examination of Daniel and Margaret's financial records, telephone data, and property history. Later that afternoon, official confirmation arrived from the forensic laboratory. Dental records positively identified the remains as Daniel Wilson. The entire town of Raven Hill was stunned. What had once been considered a disappearance had now become a murder investigation. Reporters quickly descended upon the small community. Television vans lined the streets outside the police station. Journalists repeatedly attempted to contact Margaret, but she refused all interviews. Inside her home, Margaret watched news coverage in horror. Every report featured photographs of Daniel and repeated the same disturbing question: who killed him? Margaret turned off the television, but she could not escape the growing fear. That evening, she received an unexpected visitor. Her longtime friend, Rebecca Hayes, arrived carrying homemade soup. Rebecca had supported Margaret throughout Daniel's disappearance. The two women sat in the kitchen discussing recent events. Rebecca expressed sympathy and concern, yet, during the conversation, Rebecca casually mentioned something that caused Margaret's blood to run cold. Rebecca recalled seeing Margaret driving Daniel's truck very early on the morning after his disappearance. According to Rebecca, she had been returning from an overnight hospital shift when she passed Margaret near the road leading toward Blackwood Forest. Margaret forced a smile and quickly explained that Rebecca must be mistaken. Rebecca seemed uncertain and dropped the subject, but after she left, Margaret realized the danger. If Rebecca shared this memory with police, investigators would begin asking difficult questions. Margaret considered contacting Rebecca to persuade her to remain silent. Eventually, she decided against it, fearing such action might appear suspicious. Meanwhile, Detective Sarah Bennett received the enhanced security footage analysis she had requested months earlier. The results were significant. Although the driver's face remained unclear, investigators concluded with high confidence that the individual driving Daniel's truck on the night of his disappearance was not Daniel. Based on body shape, height, and posture, the driver was likely female. Sarah immediately arranged another interview with Margaret. Before she could do so, however, a shocking development changed everything. During forensic examination of the Wilson residence, investigators discovered microscopic traces of blood beneath replacement floorboards in the living room. Laboratory analysis confirmed the blood belonged to Daniel. Further inspection revealed signs that sections of flooring had been removed and replaced shortly after Daniel vanished. Receipts recovered from a local hardware store showed that Margaret had purchased replacement materials 2 days after reporting Daniel missing. The evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Sarah obtained a search warrant and returned to the Wilson home with a forensic team. Margaret watched nervously as investigators examined every room. Hours passed. Then one investigator called Sarah into the garage. Hidden inside a storage cabinet was a toolbox containing cleaning supplies. Among them was a pair of heavy work gloves. Forensic testing later revealed tiny traces of Daniel's blood on one glove. That evening, Sarah reviewed the growing evidence. The case against Margaret was strengthening rapidly, yet Sarah still lacked one critical element: a clear explanation of what had happened inside the house. She needed either a confession or proof strong enough to convince a jury beyond doubt. Unknown to Sarah, Margaret was reaching her breaking point. Alone inside the silent house, she felt trapped from every direction. Sleep became impossible. Every creaking floorboard seemed threatening. Every passing car appeared to belong to police. She began seeing Daniel everywhere. One night she awoke suddenly and found a man standing at the foot of her bed. In the darkness, she recognized Daniel immediately. He wore the same clothes he had worn on the night he died. Mud covered his face. Margaret screamed and switched on the bedside lamp. The figure vanished instantly. She sat trembling until sunrise. The next morning, exhausted and terrified, Margaret visited the local church seeking comfort. Father Michael listened patiently as she described her anxiety, though she concealed the true reason behind it. Before leaving, Father Michael offered a simple piece of advice. Secrets, no matter how carefully buried, always find a way back to the surface. Margaret left the church deeply unsettled. She could not stop thinking about those words. Later that evening, while preparing tea, the electricity suddenly failed. The house plunged into darkness. Margaret searched for candles. As she opened a kitchen drawer, she discovered something impossible. Resting inside the drawer was Daniel's wristwatch. Margaret had buried that watch with his body in Blackwood Forest. She remembered placing it beside him with her own hands. Terrified beyond reason, she dropped the watch and stumbled backward. At that exact moment, 3 loud knocks echoed from the front door. Margaret stared toward the entrance, her heart pounding violently. The knocking came again, louder this time. Then she heard a familiar voice from outside. "Mrs. Wilson, this is Detective Sarah Bennett. We need to speak with you immediately." Margaret stood frozen in the dark kitchen as Detective Sarah Bennett's voice echoed through the house. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, each second seeming heavier than the last. Her eyes remained fixed on the front door, while her heart pounded violently inside her chest. For a brief moment, she considered ignoring the knocking, pretending she was not home. But Sarah knocked again, this time more firmly. "Mrs. Wilson, please open the door." Margaret quickly picked up Daniel's wristwatch from the floor and slipped it into her pocket. Her hands trembled so badly that she nearly dropped it again. She took a deep breath, switched on a flashlight, and slowly walked toward the entrance. When she opened the door, she found Detective Sarah Bennett standing beside another officer. Rain drizzled steadily outside, soaking the front steps. Sarah studied Margaret carefully. Margaret looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded her eyes, and her normally neat appearance had deteriorated noticeably. Sarah had expected this. Pressure often revealed cracks in people who had been hiding secrets for a long time. Sarah spoke gently. She explained that investigators needed clarification regarding several pieces of evidence. Margaret invited them inside. The officers sat in the living room while Margaret prepared coffee, mostly to give herself a few extra minutes to think. As she entered the kitchen, she instinctively reached into her pocket for Daniel's watch. It was gone. She searched frantically. The watch had disappeared. Panic surged through her body. She searched every corner of the kitchen without success. Finally, she returned to the living room, forcing herself to remain calm. Sarah began asking questions. She presented the enhanced security footage showing a female driver operating Daniel's truck during the early morning hours after his disappearance. Margaret insisted the footage was unclear and could not possibly identify anyone. Sarah then mentioned Rebecca Hayes and her memory of seeing Margaret driving near Blackwood Forest that same morning. Margaret claimed Rebecca was mistaken. Finally, Sarah revealed that Daniel's blood had been discovered beneath replacement flooring inside the house. Margaret remained silent for several seconds before explaining that Daniel had accidentally cut himself while repairing furniture several months before he vanished. Sarah listened carefully. She had heard many explanations during her career. Some were truthful, others desperate. Margaret's explanation sounded rehearsed. Before leaving, Sarah informed Margaret that the investigation was continuing and advised her not to leave town. As soon as the officers departed, Margaret collapsed onto the sofa and began crying uncontrollably. She understood what Sarah had not said directly. The police believed she had killed Daniel. The walls of her carefully constructed world were closing around her. The following morning, Detective Sarah Bennett received another important forensic report. Soil samples collected from the tires of Daniel's abandoned truck matched soil recovered from the burial site in Blackwood Forest. More significantly, forensic specialists discovered tiny fibers embedded within the plastic wrapping used around Daniel's body. Laboratory comparisons showed those fibers matched carpeting from the Wilson home. Sarah knew the evidence was becoming overwhelming, yet she still wanted to understand precisely what had happened on the night Daniel died. She decided to speak with people who had known the couple closely. Sarah spent several days interviewing neighbors, relatives, and friends. Gradually, a troubling picture emerged. Many described frequent arguments inside the Wilson home. Several neighbors recalled hearing shouting during the months preceding Daniel's disappearance. One neighbor, elderly Mrs. Evelyn Carter, remembered hearing an especially violent argument on the very night Daniel vanished. According to Mrs. Carter, she had heard glass shattering shortly before 11 o'clock. Another witness recalled seeing Daniel with bruises on several occasions. Yet other witnesses described Daniel as controlling and increasingly aggressive. Sarah began considering the possibility that Daniel's death may indeed have occurred during a domestic confrontation. Meanwhile, Margaret's mental condition continued deteriorating. Sleep abandoned her completely. She became convinced that Daniel's presence remained inside the house. One evening, she heard music playing softly from the living room. She followed the sound and discovered Daniel's favorite record spinning on the old record player. She clearly remembered placing that record in storage months earlier. Another night, she awoke to find muddy footprints leading from the front door to her bedroom. Terrified, she called police again. Officers searched the property thoroughly and found no evidence of an intruder. They gently suggested grief counseling. Margaret agreed to begin therapy, hoping it might quiet the terrifying experiences. During her first session, psychologist Dr. Helen Morris encouraged Margaret to discuss her emotions regarding Daniel's disappearance and death. Margaret spoke cautiously, avoiding the truth. Yet, as the conversation continued, she unexpectedly revealed details that had never been publicly released. She mentioned that Daniel had been struck on the head. Dr. Morris immediately noticed the inconsistency. Police had never disclosed the exact cause of death. After the session ended, Dr. Morris became deeply concerned. Bound by professional ethics, she could not reveal confidential discussions without legal justification. However, she documented the conversation carefully. Several days later, Margaret received an anonymous letter. The envelope contained no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing only one sentence. "I know what happened that night." Margaret read the sentence repeatedly. Fear consumed her. Who had written it? Had someone seen her in Blackwood Forest? Had Daniel told someone about their argument before his death? The possibilities tormented her. The next day, another envelope arrived. This one contained a photograph. The image showed Blackwood Forest, specifically the area where Daniel had been buried. Written on the back were the words, "Secrets never stay buried." Margaret nearly fainted. She immediately contacted Detective Sarah Bennett and reported the letters. Sarah examined the messages carefully. She suspected someone in Raven Hill was attempting to frighten Margaret, perhaps believing she was responsible for Daniel's death. Investigators searched for fingerprints and DNA, but found nothing useful. Sarah privately wondered whether guilt itself was beginning to destroy Margaret. Unknown to both women, the letters had actually been sent by local journalist Michael Dawson. Michael had spent months investigating Daniel's disappearance independently, hoping to uncover a major story. After learning about the discovery of Daniel's remains, he had become convinced Margaret was involved. Hoping to provoke a reaction, he sent the anonymous letters. His reckless decision would soon have serious consequences. One rainy afternoon, Margaret noticed Michael's vehicle parked outside her house. Furious and frightened, she confronted him. Their argument quickly escalated. Michael accused Margaret of hiding the truth. Margaret denied everything and demanded that he leave. Neighbors witnessed the confrontation. Later that evening, Michael failed to return home. His family reported him missing the following morning. Raven Hill was immediately thrown into chaos. Fear spread rapidly. Some residents whispered that Margaret had silenced Michael to protect herself. Others believed Michael had simply left town temporarily. Detective Sarah Bennett refused to speculate. She launched an urgent search. Fortunately, Michael was located alive 2 days later in a neighboring county. He had pursued an investigative lead and lost phone service while traveling through remote areas. Although relieved, Sarah strongly criticized Michael for interfering with an active homicide investigation. Michael reluctantly admitted sending the anonymous letters. Sarah was furious. His actions could have compromised the entire case. Margaret, however, reacted differently. Learning that Michael had written the letters brought relief, yet it also forced her to confront a painful truth. She had become terrified not because of the letters themselves, but because deep inside, she knew she was guilty. That realization shattered something within her. That night, Margaret sat alone in the living room staring at the fireplace where Daniel had fallen 6 months earlier. Memories flooded back with terrible clarity. For the first time, she allowed herself to remember everything exactly as it had happened. The argument, the shouting, Daniel blocking her path, the struggle, the fall. Tears streamed down her face. She whispered repeatedly, "It was an accident." Yet another voice inside her asked a haunting question. If it truly had been an accident, why had she hidden the body? Why had she lied to everyone? Why had she allowed an entire town to search desperately for a man she knew was dead? Near midnight, Margaret heard a noise upstairs. She ignored it. Then came another sound, unmistakable this time. Someone was walking slowly across the bedroom floor. Margaret grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs. The hallway was empty. As she approached the bedroom, she noticed the door standing open. Written across the bedroom mirror in large letters was a chilling message. The words appeared to be written in mud. "Tell them the truth!" Margaret screamed. Yet when police arrived minutes later, they found the mirror completely clean. There was no writing, no mud, and no sign that anyone had entered the house. Detective Sarah Bennett looked carefully at Margaret and quietly realized something important. Margaret was approaching her breaking point, and when that moment finally arrived, the truth about Daniel Wilson's death might at last emerge. Detective Sarah Bennett drove away from the Wilson house shortly after 2:00 in the morning, but Margaret remained standing in her bedroom long after the police had left. The mirror was perfectly clean. There was no mud, no writing, and no evidence that anyone had touched it. Yet Margaret knew what she had seen. The words had been there. She could still picture them clearly. Tell them the truth. She slowly sat on the edge of her bed, her body shaking uncontrollably. For 6 months she had carried the weight of Daniel's death alone. She had convinced herself that she could live with the secret. She had believed that if she stayed calm and maintained her story, everything would eventually return to normal. Instead, her life had become a prison built from fear, guilt, and constant suspicion. Every sound frightened her. Every unexpected visitor made her panic. Every knock on the door filled her with dread. By sunrise, Margaret had still not slept. She walked downstairs and prepared coffee, but after pouring a cup, she simply stared at it without drinking. Her eyes drifted toward the living room. She could almost see Daniel standing there, exactly where he had stood on that terrible night. The memory returned with painful clarity. Daniel had arrived home angry and intoxicated. He had accused her of hiding money. The argument had escalated rapidly. He had demanded access to her savings account, money Margaret had secretly set aside because she feared their financial future. Daniel had become furious. He had smashed a glass against the fireplace and grabbed Margaret by the arm when she attempted to leave the room. Until now, Margaret had never admitted even to herself how frightened she had been that night. Their marriage had deteriorated badly during the previous 2 years. Daniel's temper had grown increasingly unpredictable. Several times he had pushed her during arguments. Once he had punched a hole through a bedroom door. Margaret had hidden these incidents from friends and family because she was ashamed and afraid. On the night Daniel died, she genuinely believed he might seriously harm her. Yet fear alone did not fully explain what happened next. As Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, she forced herself to remember every detail. During the struggle, Daniel had stumbled backwards. He had lost his balance and struck his head against the marble table. He collapsed immediately. Margaret remembered kneeling beside him, calling his name repeatedly. There had been blood. There had been silence. Then something unexpected had happened. Daniel had opened his eyes briefly. He had still been alive. Margaret remembered it clearly now. His breathing had been weak, but he had been alive. She had considered calling emergency services. She had even picked up her phone. But then she had imagined police officers arriving, seeing the broken glass, learning about their violent argument, and accusing her of murder. She had panicked. She had convinced herself that Daniel would die anyway. Instead of calling for help, she had waited. Nearly 40 minutes later, Daniel had stopped breathing. The realization struck Margaret with devastating force. Tears streamed down her face. For months she had told herself that Daniel died instantly. Now she understood that this was not entirely true. Perhaps he could have survived. Perhaps if she had called for help immediately, everything would have been different. The guilt became unbearable. Later that morning, Detective Sarah Bennett received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Helen Morris. The psychologist informed Sarah that Margaret had canceled all future therapy sessions and had sounded deeply distressed during their final conversation. Although Dr. Morris remained bound by confidentiality, she expressed serious concern regarding Margaret's emotional state. Sarah thanked her and decided to conduct a welfare check. When Sarah arrived at the Wilson home shortly after noon, she found the front door slightly open. Concerned, she entered cautiously while announcing her presence. The house was silent. Sarah searched each room. Finally, she discovered Margaret sitting in the backyard beneath an old oak tree. Margaret appeared exhausted. Dark circles surrounded her eyes, and her clothes were wrinkled. Sarah sat beside her quietly. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Margaret, I know you are carrying something very heavy." Margaret stared at the ground. Sarah continued gently. "People make terrible decisions when they are afraid, but hiding the truth rarely makes the pain disappear." Margaret remained silent. Sarah did not pressure her further. Instead, she simply handed Margaret her business card and stood to leave before walking away. Sarah said softly, "When you are ready to tell the truth, I will listen." After Sarah departed, Margaret sat beneath the tree for another hour. For the first time since Daniel's death, she seriously considered confessing. Yet fear still controlled her. She worried about prison. She worried about public shame. Most of all, she feared learning that Daniel might have survived if she had called for help. That evening, Ravenhill experienced a severe thunderstorm. Powerful winds swept across the town, knocking down branches and causing widespread power outages. Margaret spent the evening alone by candlelight. Shortly after 10 o'clock, she heard a loud crash from upstairs. Grabbing a flashlight, she slowly climbed the staircase. The sound had come from Daniel's old study, a room she rarely entered. When she opened the door, she discovered that several boxes had fallen from a shelf during the storm. Papers and photographs lay scattered across the floor. As Margaret knelt to clean the mess, she noticed a small leather journal she had never seen before. Curious, she opened it. The journal belonged to Daniel. It contained personal entries spanning the previous 3 years. Margaret hesitated before reading, but curiosity soon overcame her reluctance. The early entries described Daniel's financial struggles and growing stress. Later entries became darker. Daniel wrote about feeling like a failure. He expressed frustration regarding his failing business and mounting debts. Then Margaret discovered an entry dated only 2 weeks before his death. Her hands trembled as she read the words. Daniel admitted that he had become angry and controlling. He acknowledged frightening Margaret during arguments. He wrote that he desperately wanted to repair their marriage, but did not know how. The final sentence shattered Margaret completely. If anything ever happens to me, I hope Margaret knows that despite everything, I never stopped loving her. Margaret burst into tears. For months she had remembered only Daniel's anger. Reading his private thoughts forced her to confront the complexity of their relationship. Neither of them had been entirely innocent. Both had made mistakes. Yet Daniel was gone forever. Around midnight, another unexpected knock echoed through the house. Margaret froze immediately. Slowly she approached the front door and looked through the window. To her surprise, she saw Rebecca Hayes standing outside, soaked by rain. Margaret quickly invited her inside. Rebecca explained that she had been worried and wanted to check on her friend. The two women sat together in the kitchen. Eventually, Rebecca spoke quietly. "Margaret, I have known you for 20 years. I know something terrible happened that night." Margaret looked away. Rebecca continued gently. "You do not have to tell me what happened. But whatever it is, this secret is destroying you." Margaret began crying. For several minutes she could not speak. Finally she whispered, "I never meant for any of this to happen." Rebecca reached across the table and held her hand. "Then tell the truth," she said softly. "Whatever happens next, at least the nightmare will end." After Rebecca left, Margaret sat alone until dawn. As sunlight slowly entered the kitchen, she made a decision. She walked upstairs, opened the bedroom wardrobe, and removed a small locked box hidden beneath folded blankets. Inside were several items she had concealed 6 months earlier. There was Daniel's wedding ring, the clothes she had worn on the night he died, and the mobile phone she had taken from his pocket before burying him. Margaret placed the items into a bag. Then she picked up her car keys. She intended to drive to the police station and finally confess everything. But as she stepped outside, she noticed something that caused her to stop instantly. Parked across the street was an unfamiliar black sedan. A man sat behind the wheel watching her house. When the man realized Margaret had noticed him, he immediately drove away. Margaret stood frozen. Had the police placed her under surveillance, or was someone else watching her? Unsettled and uncertain, she returned inside. She never reached the police station that morning. Several hours later, Detective Sarah Bennett received an urgent call from dispatch. Officers responding to a report of suspicious activity at the Wilson residence had made a shocking discovery. Margaret Wilson was missing. Her front door stood wide open, her car remained parked in the driveway, and scattered across the kitchen floor were the contents of a partially packed confession bag. Detective Sarah Bennett arrived at the Wilson residence within minutes of receiving the emergency call. Police vehicles surrounded the property, and several officers were already searching the nearby woods and roads. Sarah stepped inside the house and immediately noticed the open front door swaying gently in the morning wind. The kitchen appeared disturbed, but there were no signs of a struggle. Scattered across the floor were several personal items. Daniel's wedding ring, a set of clothes stained with old brown marks, and an old mobile phone. Sarah carefully examined the scene. It looked as though Margaret had been preparing to leave in a hurry. Then she noticed a handwritten note lying beneath a chair. The note contained only a few words. "I cannot live with this anymore. I am sorry." Sarah immediately feared that Margaret might harm herself. A large search operation began across Raven Hill. Officers searched nearby parks, forests, abandoned buildings, and roads. Hours passed without success. Meanwhile, news of Margaret's disappearance spread rapidly throughout town. Reporters gathered once again outside the police station. Speculation intensified. Some believed Margaret had fled to avoid arrest. Others feared she had taken her own life. Sarah refused to make assumptions. Something about the situation troubled her. Margaret had left behind her purse, money, and identification. People planning to disappear usually took such items. Sarah suspected Margaret had intended to surrender, but something had interrupted her. While reviewing security footage from roads surrounding the Wilson home, investigators made a startling discovery. Cameras captured an unfamiliar black sedan driving repeatedly past Margaret's house during the previous week. More importantly, footage from the morning of Margaret's disappearance showed the same vehicle parked across the street shortly before she vanished. Investigators traced the registration to a private investigator named Richard Hale. Sarah quickly located and questioned him. Richard admitted that he had been watching Margaret for several days, but insisted he had never approached her. He explained that Daniel's younger brother, Stephen Wilson, had hired him. Stephen had never believed Margaret's story regarding Daniel's disappearance and wanted independent confirmation of her involvement. Richard denied any role in Margaret's disappearance. His alibi checked out. Although embarrassed by his actions, he was released. The investigation returned to uncertainty. As evening approached, search teams expanded operations into Blackwood Forest. Shortly before sunset, an officer discovered fresh footprints leading toward the abandoned Wilson property where Daniel's remains had been found. Sarah personally followed the trail. Deep within the forest, she finally saw a figure sitting beside the excavation site. It was Margaret. She sat silently on the wet ground, staring at the empty grave. Sarah approached slowly. Margaret did not move. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Finally, Margaret whispered, "I knew you would find me here." Sarah sat beside her. The forest remained completely silent, except for distant birds and the soft sound of wind moving through the trees. Margaret stared at the ground and began speaking. "I came here because this is where everything ended and where everything truly began." Tears filled her eyes. "I wanted to confess before, but I was afraid." Sarah listened quietly. Margaret continued. She described years of growing tension within her marriage. She spoke about Daniel's financial problems, his anger, and the fear she often felt. Then she described the night of his death in painful detail. She admitted that during their argument, Daniel had grabbed her. They struggled. Daniel fell and struck his head. Margaret began crying uncontrollably as she revealed the truth she had only recently allowed herself to remember. Daniel had still been alive after the fall. Instead of immediately calling emergency services, she had panicked. She waited. By the time she finally accepted the seriousness of his condition, it was too late. "I kept telling myself it was an accident," Margaret whispered. "Maybe the fall was. But hiding him, lying to everyone, allowing people to search for him while I knew the truth, that was my choice." Sarah asked softly, "Why did you not call for help?" Margaret looked toward the empty grave. "Because I was afraid nobody would believe me. I thought everyone would see me as a murderer." She paused. "Now I understand that fear created something far worse." Sarah gently informed Margaret of her rights. Margaret nodded. She offered no resistance. As officers escorted her toward the waiting vehicles, she suddenly stopped and looked back at the grave one final time. "I am sorry, Daniel," she whispered. The confession sent shockwaves through Raven Hill. Many residents struggled to reconcile the compassionate woman they thought they knew with the person who had concealed such a terrible secret. Others expressed sympathy, believing years of fear and emotional abuse had contributed to the tragedy. Prosecutors carefully reviewed the evidence. After extensive investigation, they concluded that Daniel's death had likely resulted from the struggle rather than a deliberate attack. However, Margaret still faced serious charges for failing to seek medical assistance, concealing a death, destroying evidence, and misleading investigators. The trial began several months later. The courtroom remained crowded throughout proceedings. Witnesses testified regarding the troubled marriage, Daniel's increasingly aggressive behavior, and Margaret's actions following his death. Detective Sarah Bennett presented the physical evidence. Rebecca Hayes spoke emotionally about watching her friend slowly collapse beneath the weight of guilt. Dr. Helen Morris described Margaret's deteriorating mental state. Finally, Margaret herself took the stand. With remarkable honesty, she admitted everything. She accepted responsibility for her choices and expressed profound remorse. "I cannot change what happened," she told the court. "But if sharing the truth prevents someone else from making decisions based on fear, then perhaps some good can come from this tragedy." After several days of testimony, the jury reached its verdict. Margaret was acquitted of intentional murder. However, she was convicted on multiple related charges connected to concealing Daniel's death and obstructing the investigation. The judge acknowledged the complex circumstances surrounding the case, including evidence of domestic conflict and Margaret's eventual confession. Nevertheless, he emphasized that fear never justifies hiding the truth. Margaret received a prison sentence, but significantly shorter than many had expected. Years later, following her release, Margaret quietly relocated to another community where she began volunteering with organizations supporting victims of domestic abuse. She rarely spoke publicly about her past, but on occasion she shared her story with counseling groups. Her message remained simple and powerful. Secrets do not disappear simply because they are hidden. Fear grows stronger in silence. The truth, no matter how painful, remains the only path toward healing. Detective Sarah Bennett eventually retired after a distinguished career. Yet among all the cases she investigated, she often remembered the Wilson case most clearly. It reminded her that human beings are rarely completely innocent or completely guilty. Life is often far more complicated. Choices made during moments of fear can reshape countless lives forever. The old Wilson house remained empty for many years. Some residents claimed strange sounds could still be heard inside during stormy nights. Others dismissed such stories as imagination. Yet everyone in Raven Hill agreed on one thing. They would never forget the woman who believed her secret was safe until the police knocked. Thank you for watching Dark Lantern Stories. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please like this video, subscribe to Dark Lantern Stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next mysterious tale. Also tell us in the comments, do you think Margaret deserved forgiveness? Or should she have faced a harsher punishment? And do not forget to tell us your city, country, and current time. Until next time, keep your lantern lit, because some secrets refuse to stay buried.